Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are, and welcome if you're listening to the recording. I'm Katherine, as you hopefully know by now, and I'm just playing for time while people enter the webinar room. We have got a fantastic guest today, Daniel Tammet, talking about his new book, Nine Minds. I think a lot of you will have come across Daniel many years ago and have been following his work for a long time. He was certainly one of the first autistic authors that I was aware of, and I was reading his work before I knew I was autistic. And when I had this sort of fascination with reading about autism that I couldn't quite explain, guess what? There's a plot spoiler in there somewhere. So I'm going to invite Daniel onto the stage in a moment, but just while we're all getting sorted, if you have a look in the resources tab at the bottom of your page, you can click through to buy a copy of Dan's book if you so desire. It's lovely if you can. And there's also a PDF of the reading guide for those of you that haven't read yet. That's completely fine. Everyone's welcome here. It's a great introduction to the book. And the comments and questions should be working this time. I know we've had problems with them before, I've checked, but please do say hello, not least because it helps me to see that that you're here and that everything's working. Final note, I have COVID yet again, jazz hands for that one. And I'm a little bit croaky, so please forgive me. I will do my absolute best to be clear and to not start coughing, but yeah. That was a blatant play for sympathy. Now, I am going to invite Daniel on stage. I think I remembered how to do it this time. I did just have to say I might forget how to do it. Daniel, hi, welcome. It's lovely to have you here. You are beaming in. I love the way that I'm still using the beaming in language like it's like 1992. You're beaming in from Paris today. How's everything there?
Hi, Catherine. First of all, thank you for having me.
Oh, anytime.
Lovely to be with you. Yeah, we're very excited here. It's the Olympics starting in a few days, and we've got helicopters flying just above my apartment here in the center of Paris, doing all the last minute, I guess, security checks. So, and lots of excitement, lots of palpable excitement, people getting very tense and excited about what's going to be hopefully a really great sporting
That's brilliant.
extravaganza.
I'm excited for you. As I get older, I get more interested in sport. I don't know what it is, but I think all my kind of youthful resistance to it is dying down, and the fact that I can't do it is I'm okay with that now. I've come to terms with like my lack of sportiness. So we might hear a helicopter in the background from Daniel, and of course the usual seagulls in the background from me that everybody notices except me. Like I'm seagull blind now. It is so lovely to have you here because, as I was just saying in the intro, you're one of the very early writers, autistic writers, writing about autism. When did you write your first book?
I published Born on a Blue Day in 2006. So
Wow,
nearly
okay.
20 years ago, yeah.
Gosh, that's a long time. You don't look old enough. I mean, I know we're definitely here to talk in depth about Nine Minds, and I'm looking forward to getting into it. But I really was interested to begin with to ask you how things have changed, because I mean it's it's almost like you're a bellwether for how we're seeing autism at the moment, because actually I, I, you know, please correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels to me like you were treated first of all as a sort of curio, you know, that your mind was this curious, very special, very, very unusual thing, and that there was this kind of slightly prurient fascination with you. I'd love to know what that was like for you and how that's changed for you.
Yeah, I mean, when I first started out, so nearly 20 years ago, autism was much less well understood compared to today, obviously. Um, the first reviewers and the first critics I had were broadly, positive in many respects, but there were some that were surprised that an autistic person could even write
Yeah.
a book, and wondered if it had been ghostwritten, for example. And yeah, of course there was lots of media interest around how my mind works, which is understandable.
Yeah.
Um, and some of that interest is positive, of course, because people are curious. People are always fascinated to learn more about how different kinds of minds work.
Mm.
So it's an invitation to learn more about how, other people are not always thinking, perceiving, sensing the world in the same way. That's really positive. And many people, even those who are not necessarily on the spectrum, can relate to that
Yeah.
feeling of being different on some level and not necessarily finding one's place in the world. And then, of course, there's always, as you say, that more prurient kind of interest where
Yeah.
people were, just expecting me to do calculations very quickly in my head, to kind of perform like a seal, like a performing seal. And that
Yeah.
was obviously less positive. But that was a long time ago, and it seems that with every book I've been able to, I guess, prove myself as a writer, and I guess also grow and learn and improve. It's writing
Mm.
is a lifelong journey, it's a lifelong skill. And I've taken some risks along the way. I've not stayed in one particular lane. I've written different kinds of books over time, essays and literary reportage. I've even written some books in French because I've lived in France for many years, so I write in both languages. So that would include fiction and poetry as well. So I I push myself all the time, and that's hopefully positive for many readers as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually, I kind of read through your your oeuvre, not in French, sadly, sorry, as in preparation for this, and one of the things that really struck me was what seemed to me like this progress of you moving from the topic of interest to a person who was asserting themselves as a writer
Yeah.
and as a lover of language and as a person who kind of wants to dance with that. And I hadn't that hadn't struck me before, but it really did, kind of looking at the totality. It was really
Yeah.
nice.
Yeah. I've had some starting out, there weren't a lot of models, writers
Yeah.
often want to have someone that they can look up to and not to compare themselves to necessarily, but just to say it's possible. It's possible
Mm.
to, for example, to be autistic and to be a writer, despite what
Mm.
some early critics, suggested. It's possible. And one of those models, who's actually in Nine Minds briefly, is the wonderful Australian poet Les Murray,
Yeah.
who was not only a model, who was a friend, a mentor to me. I had the wonderful chance to meet him in person when he came to Paris. We shared a stage here, and we had a correspondence over numerous years. He wasn't at all into computers, Les, so it was very much old school snail mail. So you can imagine that from Australia all the way to France, it took some time writing. But I have these wonderful postcards from him, with his incredible handwriting, and so he was incredibly encouraging. A wonderful neurodivergent poet, author of many books, Nobel Prize in literature candidate many times,
Mm.
very
Mm.
serious contender, and critics kind of didn't know what to make of his autism. It just didn't seem to fit
Yeah.
um, with their preconceptions of what a poet or a writer is, and autistic just isn't part of it at all for them. So they kind of pushed that to the margins, and it took Les and certain readers and people around him, including some who are on the spectrum as well, to say, no, this is really important. This is really part of his
Mm.
work.
Mm.
It explains so much about how his wonderful mind worked and his wonderful poetry as well. And you can't understand Les without also recognizing the contribution that autism made, a positive
Yeah.
contribution. to his work.
Incredibly positive. And it's so interesting now because I seem to see a different author every day who's now received their autism diagnosis or is,
Yeah.
self-identified. And I now begin to wonder, whether it's actually, we should begin to see it as a prerequisite for the kind of level of obsession, attention to detail, the ability to hold a massive idea in your mind. I don't know. But I do know that when I received my diagnosis, I the psychiatrist paused and said the one thing that goes in contradiction to all of this is that you're evidently creative, and autistic people aren't creative. And that was 8 years ago, 7 years ago.
Yeah.
Such recent history, and in that time, I hope he'll have understood this now, that the research has really moved towards creativity as like a defining part of what we are rather than an anomaly.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean the pace of change is so fast, and we're all learning. I wonder what shifts in your perspective have happened in the time that you've been writing on the topic. How do you or have you seen it exactly the same all the way through? I just wondered what you've noticed yourself and where you've had to kind of adapt.
So the thing about creativity, something obviously I met very often, unfortunately, for a long time, um, and the example of someone like Les, the wonderful poet, helped reassure me that it
Mm.
wasn't an anomaly, as you say. That,
Yeah.
and looking back through history, there are many examples. We can't be sure, of course. Diagnosis
Mm.
retrospectively isn't possible, but we can imagine that there are all these wonderful minds, including many writers and poets who were eccentric, considered eccentric in their day, and
Yeah.
would certainly seem to fit the criteria that we have nowadays for diagnosing autism. So, but yeah, the other thing that always strikes me as frustrating is empathy, the question of empathy, and the idea as well that people on the spectrum
Mm.
struggle with empathy. And I kind of feel, and I've seen this written so well elsewhere, that it goes both ways. Empathy goes both ways. It's also for what we call nowadays neurotypical people to show empathy towards their neurodivergent peers, to
Mm.
understand better how their minds work, make often very small adjustments that cost
Yeah.
nothing or very little for them, but make huge difference in the lives of neurodivergent people. And it just means that society is able to function so much better because neurodivergent people are a fantastic resource. A human resource. There's so much, like you say, creativity, empathy, imagination,
Mm.
completely different ways of perceiving and solving problems and perceiving the world and understanding situations. And in this 21st century, that just seems so scary and so mind-boggling, and so like there are so many things we have to overcome together. Drawing on that resource,
Mm.
just
Mm.
seems so obvious to me. And we've seen it in people like Greta Thunberg, who's able to put the question of climate change, front and center in a way that many politicians never managed to do.
Yeah.
And yeah, and so I'm not an elder yet, but I'm looking at all these young, this
Yeah.
these future generations of autistic men and women, and saying to myself, yes, if only the world gives them the space they need to thrive in,
Mm.
they're going to make wonderful contributions. Wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely necessary. And sorry, I will move on to your book in a minute, but I don't get the chance to talk to you every day, so it's quite
Yeah.
exciting. I did read in the paper last week this kind of big fanfare announcement that scientists think they've worked out how to diagnose autism from a blood test, I think it was, or it might have been a stool sample. And isn't that great? And I kind of thought, it's that's irrelevant to me. I don't care about that in the least bit. That's the least interesting part of research you can do into autism, because once you've diagnosed us, then what? That question is still completely open. And what's more, that feels like a little bit of a power play. Like we can pretty effectively diagnose ourselves most of the time. Thank you very much. It's I the external understanding is still so shallow and so pathology led, and it's not grasping almost like what we're here to do, like our sort of function within this broad society. And I find it a little bit frustrating.
And I totally understand. I share that as well, obviously,
Yeah.
that frustration. One of the things I did learn as I was writing Nine Minds was the extent to which research around the condition, around autism, is the most interesting part of it is actually being performed by people on the spectrum themselves,
Yeah.
actual
Yeah.
um, researchers, so psychologists, researchers, who've got all of the doctorates, all of the, the qualifications, but they've also got that lived experience
Yeah.
of the condition, and they're bringing that for the first time to science, which is something that science sorely needed, because, like you say, without it, the understanding is shallow and
Mm.
it's biased, and it's not meeting autistic people's needs.
No. No, that's
So
it.
that
And
was,
interestingly, in the more kind of qualitative areas of the social sciences is where we're really doing fantastic work, which I think is, yeah, that's kind of fascinating, because it used to be the sort of insult thrown at scientists, oh, are you autistic? And it's kind of like, yeah, and now what are you going to do about that? Like, what?
yes,
Uh-huh.
exactly.
Yeah.
And I guess this is the moment to give a shout out to Kanna, the wonderful researcher, psychologist in the
Yes.
book, one of the Nine Minds, who is
Yeah.
Japanese, a wonderful young Japanese woman who struggled with her own autism. She didn't get
Mm.
diagnosed for many years because understanding of the condition is so poor in Asia and in Japan, perhaps even in particular. And she had to go to the United States to get her diagnosis. And another reason she went to the United States and later to Britain to do her research was a feeling that you probably had as well, Katherine, and certainly I had growing up, which is a sense of feeling so different, almost like a foreigner in your
Yeah.
own culture, your own country, and your own language. Even that was my experience in Canada as well.
Mm.
So that's one reason why I'm in France. My home language is French. It's the reason why Canada is um, spent many years in the United States and Britain, and
Mm.
her language of preference is English. I don't know any Japanese. So all of the interviews I did with her were in English, and her English is perfect. Really is
Mm.
perfect. And it's so astounding to imagine that she identifies so strongly with the English language, and it's such
Mm.
a, but it made so much sense to me. And I guess that's one of the advantages of writing about these lives, and including these inner lives, from the perspective of someone who is himself on the spectrum, who has that
Yeah.
lived experience. Because I wonder to what extent a neurotypical writer, I'm sure to some extent it would be possible, but still to have that time and patience and insight into how these minds and inner lives work, it it felt right. It certainly felt
Mm.
like it was the right moment to,
Definitely. Yeah.
um, as an autistic writer myself, to meet these people and listen to their stories, take huge mountains of notes, and then try and find the best way to put that onto the page so it would be accessible both to neurodivergent readers and their
Mm.
families, but to everyone else, to because I wanted it to be a book for everyone.
Yeah, it's a really striking approach, and I don't know if you've read it, but it reminded me of my first response to Lisa Tadeo's Three Women,
Yeah.
in that it draws you so close as a reader. We know that someone else is writing it, but it's almost novelistic
Yeah.
in the sort of sense of total integration with the character and their interior lives. Can you talk a little bit about how you approach that?
yeah, it felt really important for me to take that kind of approach. I mean, I loved Lisa Tadeo's work, and I thought it would be really fascinating to do something similar with neurodivergent people because
Mm.
simply because, like you were saying earlier, we for so long were um, presumed as having no imagination,
No
no
interiority.
interiority.
Yeah, yeah.
That to really push back against that, it felt like actually drawing on all these wonderful resources we have as writers, dialogue and scene setting and characterization. These were the best tools, in fact, to really show that interior life and the inner lives of these men and women from around the world, and to really dive deep into how their minds and also their hearts work,
Mm.
what's really going on inside them. And I don't think that a much drier, purely, kind of fact and figures approach would
Yeah.
have done that. It wouldn't have conveyed that texture
Mm.
to the reader.
No, texture is a lovely word to capture it, actually. There's a feel to each different, I'm going to say character, they're not characters, they're real, but to each different subject there's this real sense of inhabiting the kind of sensory world that they exist in. I mean, what how did you find that out? Like, what did you have to ask them to elicit that? Was it observation, or was it, saying, well, what would you do in this moment? Like, what questions elicit that?
Yeah. It was a really interesting process. So first of all, I had to find them. Of course, I had to find these men and women
Yeah,
who would be willing to share
that's
so
my next question.
and so obviously the media, they had spoken publicly about their autism, but the articles were often kind of low key, local press,
Mm,
um, not easy to find. So I did lots of hunting around in order to find them, and then obviously I was mindful about the diversity within neurodiversity. So I wanted there to be women, autistic women, and not just autistic men. I wanted there to be older autistic
mm,
people and younger as well. There's Ayo is a wonderful story, a Nigerian born, so black British woman, fantastic story. And so there's and I mentioned Canada, Japanese woman as well. So I was really trying to show the extent of that diversity. They were very so some of them knew me, had read my work,
mm.
were familiar with what I did as a writer, and admired that apparently, and were very happy and very proud to be part of the project from the beginning. And some didn't necessarily read, and so didn't necessarily know my work, and were very keen as well to, I guess, for reasons of raising awareness, for example, or just because it felt so, for example, for Vaughan, the surgeon, this amazing
Yeah.
hand surgeon who discovered his autism at the age of 63. He's now in his 70s. I guess he just reached a point in his life where he felt, this is my moment. I've got this story inside me, and no one's going to discover it. If I don't tell it now, it's going to be too late. So I guess there
Yeah.
was also that feeling as well of saying, this is the moment, and and so we had this wonderful rapport, this wonderful connection with him, and with the others as well, and that obviously helped. The fact I'm also on the spectrum, obviously, that played a big
Yeah.
part as well. So they trusted me to understand what they were saying. There would be, there was no question of me trying to apply neurotypical
Yeah.
concepts
External. Yeah. Yeah.
to what they were
Yeah.
getting across to me. Um, and then they had the opportunity to read the first drafts as well. So they had the opportunity to come back at me and say, this is, to fine tune, if I hadn't necessarily understood something 100%, or if they wanted me to include something in more detail or less detail. So that there was that
Mm,
as well. So it was a real collaboration.
that's lovely.
Yeah.
I wonder what the responses of people like Vaughan were to, you know, having not had that knowledge about themselves for so long, having lived such an interior life. I wonder what his response was to that. I'm thinking too of Warren actually, you know,
Yeah.
what that, I mean, I imagine it was incredibly emotional for them to see themselves memorialized like that, to see themselves presumably so well understood.
Yeah. So Vaughan, his response was incredibly positive. I mean, he was, I was very moved because
Yeah,
he's a man I admire enormously. He's a surgeon who's been working for 50 years. You know, he's a pioneer in his field. Um, and to have him, you know, um, compliment my work um, was based on, you know, the heights his career has taken him to, was obviously very high praise for me indeed.
mm,
Warren is a murder detective, or was a murder detective at the time that I interviewed him for the book. So it's obviously a more sensational kind of career. But it exists. You know, there are autistic police, men and women,
yeah,
and he has solved something like 92 murders in his career, and his autism allows him to really hone in on the tiny details, I guess, tiny clues that
yeah,
neurotypical peers wouldn't necessarily spot, and which can make all the difference between finding the culprit or not. Um, but my focus was not so much on, you know, trying to play to that kind of thrill of, you know, chasing the murder. I mean, that's part of this his story, obviously. I didn't have to do anything with
yeah,
it. You know, it was so incredible in itself. You know, he explained to me one of the most complicated cases he'd had to solve, you know, and how his autism had contributed to how he, you know, solved this particular crime. And but what struck me most of all, I mean, as much as his abilities as a detective are incredible, what struck me even more was his modesty,
right.
incredible modesty as a human being. You know, he was so shy and so self-effacing and so, but why are you writing about me? You know, why should I be in a book? You know, and I'm having to say to him, but your story is incredible. You know, how you solve these crimes, how you solve this incredibly complicated murder. It's
Mm,
fascinating. You know, for neurotypical or neurodivergent people alike. You know, it's just. I mean, I grew up on
yeah,
Sherlock Holmes, like
yeah. So it
a
was
lot of
super
us.
exciting for
Yeah,
you.
but I always felt that someone like him existed, and not in the way that
Mm.
they're presented often on TV, you know, because nowadays you get these autistic surgeons, these
Yeah,
autistic,
and they're almost psychic. They're like, ooh, yeah.
yeah,
It gets
and
woo quite quickly. Yeah,
yeah, and I was certain that these people really did exist, but they're much more interesting than fiction,
yeah.
and their inner lives were much richer and much more, yeah, complex. And but that's what readers like. They like that
Mm.
complexity. You have to trust readers
Oh
to,
yeah,
which is often what TV doesn't do. TV doesn't want to trust us with any sort of complexity. It's very simple. It's very woo, as you say.
yeah.
So I kind of said, no, I'm going to trust readers with this. I'm going to give them all of the texture of these people's inner lives. And but yeah, Warren is a fascinating man.
I mean, it was again. It kind of read like fiction to read about his process, and he did have that sort of slightly heroic quality about him in a way. You know, the sort of the flawed hero.
Yeah.
And but equally like the you know the kind of quieter accounts, people like Canna, who you've already mentioned, people like Amanda, and there's a kind of sense of service that runs through all of these different people. I think that was one of the themes that really jumped out for me, was this sense that different people wanted to serve in a different way. They wanted to draw out their love of somebody else to share it with other people. Or I was so moved by Canna's research into loneliness, because I think that I think she's completely right. I think loneliness is a huge problem across all of society, and particularly for autistic people. She's completely nailed it. But her knowledge of that couldn't overcome her own sense of loneliness too, which was so poignant. And I have just accidentally locked my keyboard. I locked myself out of my own computer then. That was quite impressive. Um, yeah, can you talk to me a bit about the characteristics that your different interviewees shared? What sprung out for you? What are we?
Yeah. Well, we're very different,
Mm,
in many ways, and so the diversity is there in the range of stories, that I share. Amanda, you mentioned Amanda. Amanda is such
yeah.
an amazing person because she's both autistic and blind. She was born blind, and she explains to me in the chapter, obviously, about her, how she perceives the world
Mm,
as an autistic blind person. And I'm sure something like this happens for many people who are born blind, like Amanda, but I'm sure that the autism makes it just that much more intense. So what she's
yeah.
doing is what scientists call echolocation. It's what bats and whales also do when they're navigating the world. Instead of light and sight, obviously, she's navigating by virtue of sound. So she can
Mm,
hear the dimensions of a room she enters, in such high accuracy, such a high degree of accuracy, to such a high degree of accuracy that she could tell you how big the room is, just by entering,
wow.
and
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
furniture, the kinds of furniture, how many chairs there are, and whether the table is square or round, or um, and a bottle, if she had a bottle of water on one of the tables, she could tell you if the bottle was half full or three-quarters full, because it makes a different sound in her mind. It makes a different sound
Mm,
depending on how full or not the bottle is. So that that level of perceptual, uh, intricate knowledge and understanding, and for someone like myself, is very visual.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
it's blew my mind. It just made me realize how autistic people who don't have sight,
Mm,
um, but have all of the gifts that autism can give us. That, like you were mentioning earlier, Catherine, that the level of detail and the intensity of the perceptions that we can have, how that helps her, to have a
yeah.
perception of the world which
Yeah.
is fantastically sophisticated and compelling. And she doesn't
Mm,
feel her blindness as something that imprisons her.
yeah.
She's made her way in the world. She's a fantastic academic. She studies poetry, and writing and creativity, and she reads with brow, obviously. So she's reading with her hands, not with her
Yeah.
eyes. And
Yeah.
again, how she describes what different words feel like.
I loved that.
Yeah. I'm sure you could relate to that, and
I
myself as well.
yeah. I mean, I what that drew out for me, I think, is that kind of. I mean, you've written a lot about synaesthesia,
Yeah,
that that sort of merging of the senses that I think is one of the characteristics of being autistic. And I've often talked about like the mouthfeel of words. I
yeah,
choose my words by how, not the mouthfeel of saying them, but they have a sort of physical texture to me that I feel in my mouth.
yeah,
And I've run workshops with younger children. As kids get older, they can't do it, but younger children can do exactly what I can do with words, and they can sort of taste their way through a sentence,
yeah,
because they're not putting up barriers to it.
exactly.
And like you writing about a blind person, and it made me think about what it must be like for reading to be something you feel through your skin. That felt so exciting to me as an idea.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one of the driving ideas in the book, really helping readers to experience all of the different ways in which neurodivergent perceptions open up windows, I guess, in neurotypical minds. it's about opening those windows and saying, okay, and these are windows that are opened on their own minds as well, because as different as we are, as neurodivergent men and women, we're human, we're human beings. We have
Yeah.
dreams and desires and frustrations and hopes and fears, and that's something that's very little described in literature. It's almost absent, and so it was about writing a book that could fill that gap, in
Mm.
bookshelves everywhere.
Yeah.
Because unless we do that, unless we tell these stories, um, Amanda, Vaughan, Canna, Warren, these people, they don't exist otherwise. It's like literature has kind of, it's literature reflects the world. So if these stories aren't there, aren't told, aren't written, aren't read, it's like we don't exist, in a way. And so it felt really important for that reason as well, as a writer, from an autistic writer, to tell these stories and to tell them well and to tell them with all the resources that writing gives
Mm.
us.
To tell them with tenderness, which I think is what you've really, really brought to it. Talk to me about Cedric, because presumably he's more famous in France than he is in England. I've not heard of him. He is doing something that would be one of my barriers. I would think that's not a career that I could do, and therefore I'd assume that other autistic people can't do it too, which is always the wrong assumption to make. So
Yeah.
let's talk about him. He was fascinating.
Yeah. So Cedric is, he's a very famous person in France. I met him not long after I came to the country. I guess he would have seen me on stage somewhere to give a conference. He gives lots of conferences as well. He's a mathematician originally. He won back in, I think it was 2010, he won the Fields Medal, which is the important prize in mathematics, kind of like the Nobel Prize in mathematics. And what drew a lot of media attention around him is he has a very unique style. He has his unique style, which is a suit which seems to come out of the 18th or 19th century. He's got the watch, the chain watch on the chain, and the the cravat and and a spider brooch he wears constantly wherever he goes, and apparently he's got a collection of 60 of them. And the media are always asking him, but which country are you? Which century are you from? And what is this about? And he's just very humble. Another example of humility, very down to earth, very simple. And he just says, "But this is me. This is who I am. I'm not." And it's true. Wherever he goes, this is how he dresses, and he's been dressing like this since he was a teenager. Because I describe his journey in the book, obviously, how he found his way in the world, how he found confidence in himself, which he hadn't had as a child growing up. And and at some point he decides to become a politician. It's kind of a decision that is forced on him by circumstance. I don't think he necessarily anticipated ever going into politics at all, but in 2017 there was an election in France which was unlike any other.
Well, since the last until the most recent one.
It was, the left and the right completely exploded on both sides, and it left this centrist candidate, Macron, the current president, to become elected, become president. And he decided to govern in a new way. He claimed it was a new way, a new politics. And he brought in people from outside of politics. And one of those was Cedric. And Cedric was open to that conception, this idea of a new way of doing politics, and that obviously has appeal for many people who feel like we need to completely start over, how we do politics and how we talk about our lives as well, and how we find solutions together. And because of his amazing mind, given his mathematical skills and so on. So it seemed like he had a lot of qualities. And what happened is at one point he wanted to, after a few years in the guess we call it the Parliament, National Assembly in France, he decided he would be candidate to become mayor of Paris, just a huge responsibility like the mayor of London or the mayor of New York. And he ran on his own ticket because the party which he'd been so loyal to and which he'd lent his amazing career and name and reputation to, just pushed him aside, and put someone in his place who had no credentials other than, being a run-of-the-mill politician.
Yeah.
And, who obviously had all of the insider connections, which Cedric didn't have. And out of that disappointment and frustration, he said, no, I'm going to continue running. I'm going to be a candidate, an independent candidate, because, I've got so much support around me. People are telling me you have to run, you can bring something new to politics. So he ran, and obviously he didn't win.
No.
It's very hard to
But he
win.
went out there. I mean, that's
Exactly.
so many of these people are so inspiring, and I see them do things that I can't do, but I can also really see the commonality in their approach and the way that they navigate the world and the way that they receive the world around them.
Yeah.
There's and I just saw Beth was commenting that that she knows a lot. She's autistic herself, and she knows a lot of people who dress anachronistically, and it's been dubbed history bounding, which is lovely.
It is lovely. Yes.
But it does seem quite common in autistic people to pick a very distinct style, and that is almost like comforting. It's like it gets fixed quite early on. My friend's daughter saw a photo of me as a child recently and said, "You've had the same haircut since you were 3." I was like, "Oh yeah," and it will never change, my face recognition's really bad, and I think sometimes I need to look the same to myself every day, as otherwise it just doesn't look right, and I'm very easily undermined by that. But it was really lovely to read about him and his very particular way of presenting himself, and I thought it was really nice to see as part of this beautiful representation of all of these different people.
Yeah.
We are in the final segment here, and I don't want to keep you too long. I'm just going to turn around to avoid the sun, which is now shining in my eyes. People here in the audience, if you've got any questions, please do answer them. There is a questions box that makes it really easy for me to see them rather than putting them in the main chat. Someone's now got a crush on Cedric, which is good to know. I've got so many things I want to ask you. But I wonder what the reception's been like in the outside world. You were serialised in the Telegraph, which is fantastic. How have non-autistic people responded to these people that to us seem so fully realised and gorgeous and recognisable?
Well, so far so good. I mean, it's early days. Obviously, the book only came out 10 days ago here in the UK and Ireland. And it comes out in Europe in the autumn. But so far, people have been really. I mean, I was on BBC Breakfast, and the presenters were so lovely and really.
Who did you get to meet on? I want to know now. Who did you meet on BBC
It was
Breakfast?
Charlie, and Naggie, and they were
I met her at a party once. She's so beautiful.
Yeah, she is. But I said she's number 11. I said to her afterwards, "You're the number 11. 11 is such a beautiful number," and she was happy.
She was thrilled with that.
Yeah, she was. And she asked me to sign her copy of the book, and so I wrote her name and upset, but I wrote 11 as well. Because for me, she's like the number 11. So. And so they were really enthusiastic, and everyone's been lovely so far. So Times Radio, The Guardian, there was a lovely review in The Guardian as well. Last Saturday, I think it was. So far so good. You never know, and you're not when we write, we don't write for reviewers, we don't write for journalists, we write for our readers, So, but I've had some lovely messages as well from people who've started reading it, and like you say, it's so new to so many people to be reading about autistic lives in this way. For so long, it's been kind of like Oliver Sacks, the only way into autistic lives was Oliver Sacks. And
Yeah.
he was a
Or Temple
wonderful writer.
Grandin, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Had wonderful gifts as a writer and a doctor.
Mm.
But for some reason, his empathy kind of failed him.
Yeah.
Bizarrely, when it came to autistic lives, he
Mm.
describes in his most famous book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, meeting autistic twins, and he describes them as a grotesque Tweedledee and Tweedledum,
That's horrible.
and
Yeah.
and absurd little professors. Obviously, I hope and I imagine
Borrowing the direct Leo Cannon language there as well.
if he was writing today, I'm sure he wouldn't have used that
No.
language. I'm sure. So it's partly the time that he was writing in the 1980s. But, I'm a child of the 80s. So it just shows you how much progress we've made as a
Well, and
society.
I say this all the time, but I studied psychology as part of my degree. I learnt about autism, and I didn't recognize myself in a single part of what I learned. And I went out and repeated what I'd learnt to other people as well. I mean, it's changed a lot very quickly, but when I look back at Oliver Sacks now, a book that I really enjoyed at the time and thought, oh, this is fascinating. Look at these fascinating people. And I'm ashamed of my own response, but that was the best of what we were given at the
Yeah,
time,
it was.
actually. And it got a lot worse than that too.
Yeah,
And yeah, I I wonder. I do wonder what book he'd write about it now. And of course, these people, we're not able to challenge him and not able to ask him. But unfortunately, for a lot of people who've written harmful things, they tend to double down quite often.
yeah,
And
yeah,
it's really interesting being called a sort of a person that doesn't like to change, that's that's very stubborn, to realize how stubbornly other neurotypicals have stuck to their very fixed prejudices about what autism can be.
exactly,
And
exactly.
I yeah. Mm,
Talking about the 80s, one of the last chapter of the book, so the last of the nine minds, is the most famous.
yeah,
And even when
yes.
I couldn't actually get, because he's just so famous, he's on another planet in a way. But I managed to. This is Dan Aykroyd, the wonderful
Yes.
Hollywood comic actor, genius behind Ghostbusters, Blues Brothers, Changing Places, all these wonderful films from my childhood. And Dan, I'm so lucky because actually, I by chance, I found out that, so I have family in Ottawa, and
Okay.
I found out that one of the neighbors of my family actually grew up with Dan, and another friend of a friend went to school with him. So starting from that basis, I was able to discover all these incredible anecdotes about Dan Aykroyd's childhood, about his incredible mind, and about his autism, because about 20 years ago, about the time I was first diagnosed, he went on to National Public Radio and shared that he identified, or he'd been diagnosed as Asperger's, as we said at
Yeah.
the time,
Yeah. Yeah.
and and I almost fell off my chair, as I say in the book, because
You're like
I'd
me and Dan Aykroyd.
yeah, I'd grown up on his films, and he's such a comic genius, and I
Yeah.
thought, talking about models, needing models to know how to feel about how we are, and what autism is like, because there's so much negativity around it, particularly back then, as even more so back then. And
Mm,
to see myself in him, to some, even to some small extent, apart from the
yeah.
fact we have the same name, Daniel, Dan. Um, it was incredible. So, and going through the anecdotes and writing his story, and it's stuff that his fans, no one has written about this before. It's there in plain sight, in the
Yeah.
archives, but no one had actually done that
Yeah,
work.
I must admit, I had no idea until I
Yeah,
read it. I mean, there's a lot of names I do know, and my little radar's out for it all the time. But that was, but equally at the same time, I thought, yeah, of course he is,
yeah,
obviously,
yeah.
like delightfully.
Yeah, delightfully neurodivergent, and his films, when you know that you watch Ghostbusters, you watch Blues Brothers, and you say, oh yes, the humor is, there's definitely that zaniness and that zip and that fantastic creativity as well. We're going back to what we were saying at
Absolutely.
the beginning, and the
Yeah.
fantastic autistic creativity. So getting all of those anecdotes and piecing that portrait together that had never been told before, and saying to myself, wow, this is yeah, so hopefully this is inspiring, to take one of the words you've kind of used about the book. This is inspiring, but for me personally, it was 20 years ago when I had my diagnosis and I learned this, and now writing about it, I feel inspired all over again. And hopefully some of the readers, those who grew up with him like I did, will get that, and feel that inspiration. He's a
Mm.
fantastic, that's very funny, obviously, but very human as well. And obviously, it's not all funny, with a lot of comedians.
Yeah.
But he went through a lot of difficult moments as well, and that's something I share as well. That people were very kind. That close to him, they shared the struggles he had to overcome. It makes his journey to Hollywood even more incredible than it already is.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually there is another quite defining part of autism that I think is not very well known, which is that autistic people are really funny. And
Yeah.
I when I'm with autistic people, I'm expecting to laugh really hard. Like the humor is often quite dark, often quite trenchant, but all the better for it. Like I love that kind of humor, and yeah, it was a sort of thrill to read about this yeah, maybe more vulnerable side to him.
Yeah.
And I feel like it made the recent Ghostbusters film more poignant for me as well.
Yeah. Exactly.
Him coming in as an elder,
Yeah,
and
exactly,
yeah.
exactly. And again, seeing the journey that autistic people have made and society has made, because obviously Dan is in his 70s now. So he was growing up in the 1950s, seeing autism through the eyes of a child growing up in the 1950s. I mean, it was
Mm.
fascinating, obviously, for me to research that and to write that. But, measuring the progress we've made, even if we've still got a long way to go, but still, progress for someone growing up in the 50s and where we are now in 2024, it's incredible as well.
Oh, well, Daniel, thank you so much. It has been just a joy to talk to you about all of this.
For me as well.
And to really I don't know, I wanted to hear everything about all of these people. They were such lovely company, and as you say, it's a much needed book, and I really hope that a wider audience will find this more accessible than the kind of dry facts that or the politicizing that we've all had to do about it from time to time. Say no, 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 you're wrong about us. Like this
Yeah,
is, I hope, a softer way in for people that will let them integrate this information more, and just a really pleasurable read. I couldn't put it down, and I know Rebecca felt the same. So if we're our sample of two is anything to go by, I think it's going to become very much beloved. So
thank you.
thank you, and thank you for talking to us tonight.
Thank you so much, Kathy.
And next month we will be talking to Lucy Jones about her book, which I'm terrified to pronounce now because I think it's called Matrescence, but somebody said Matrescence. I will definitely be asking her how to say it before anything else. But it's about the physiological changes that happen in women's bodies related to motherhood. It's such an interesting book, and it's been like a real creeper hit, I think. So please join us next month, and just thanks once again. It's been fantastic.
Thank you.